Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. George Bush is president because they counted votes in Florida with a method known as cheating. That doesn't happen around here because we have Doug Kellner, co-chair of the New York State Board of Elections, who works relentlessly to make sure that all of our votes count. Thank you for coming.
Well, thank you.
So is the question of the day, how are we going to vote in 2008? Not how, for whom, but by what mechanism?
By what mechanism? Well, the New York is still going to be using its trusty old lever machines in 2008. That's a pretty sure thing. And it'll be 2009 when we roll out the new systems.
Is that, and you think you'll have the systems by then?
Yes.
So let's just briefly, we've discussed this before on the program, but let's just briefly go through it. After 2000, the Congress passed a law, right? Is it Help America Vote Act, HAVA,
That's right.
And what did they do?
So there were three parts to the Help America Vote Act. One was to require new voting systems that meet increased federal standards. So far, that has been a real problem because it took quite a while to establish those standards, 2 years later than Congress expected, before the standards were finally adopted.
Who did them? The commission that was set up?
The U.S. Election Assistance Commission. And those standards were only adopted in December 2005, and what we've learned since is that there's not a single voting system on the market in the country that actually complies with those standards. So that's the big problem. Now, the Help America Vote Act also added identification requirements for new registered voters. Most of the states, including New York, have been in compliance with that for several years now. And then Congress also required provisional ballots based on the New York system. New York has had provisional ballots. We call them in New York affidavit ballots for about 20 years. And that's so if a voter comes to vote and their name is not on the registration rolls, they're given this provisional ballot, which will be counted if they can find a record.
And they swear that they sign that statement.
Right.
So the machine itself is a whole big political question, right? The manufacturers, the lobbying, the whole act of having what is it? The locale, who decides which machine differs by state to state.
That's right. Congress simply said you have to bring your voting system up to these newly adopted federal standards, and they left it to each state to decide how they would do that. In New York, our legislature basically kicked the ball into the court of the county elections commissioners, and they will make the decision based on the machines that the New York State Board certifies as meeting the standards. Now, the problem is that we have determined that not a single machine as of today meets those standards. We've given the vendors more time to try to come up to standard, and testing will start in about 2 months.
The last time we talked, we talked about the electronic voting and the Optic scanner. Were those the two systems that are still in play?
That's
what
correct.
We're talking about?
Direct recording electronic machines where the voter goes in and it looks like an automatic teller machine that you see in a bank, where the voter will push buttons on the screen indicating which candidates they want to vote for. In New York, we have a law that requires that there be a voter verifiable paper audit trail, so that the voter will push the buttons on the screen, the machine will print out a list of the voter's selections, show that to the voter, and if the voter approves the list, then that little piece of paper will drop off into a box in the machine to create a permanent record of the voter's choice.
So it's a permanent record, but it's still a secret ballot.
That's right.
Was it California that they used already electronic voting, and that who was it, the Attorney General of the state?
The Secretary of State, Deborah Bowen, who was only took office in January, but the first thing she did when she took office as Secretary of State in California was perform a top-to-bottom review of all the voting systems in use in California. And lo and behold, what did she discover? Same thing that New York discovered, which was none of the systems that they were using met all of the standards. So she's put in place a number of temporary rules so that they can increase the security on the systems that they have until they'll be able to buy new equipment.
And that state also has different counties having different machines?
That's right.
Is there any state that has a uniform system?
Most states have a uniform system, but I'd say perhaps a third of the states have leave it to the counties to select the
So
machines.
in 2008, it's not, how many states will be voting? Nobody will be voting in accordance with the HAVA. Is that right?
That's right. Well, no one will be voting on a system that's fully HAVA compliant.
Yeah.
Right.
And now, when I'm just so interested in all this primary business for 2008, the federal government, the Constitution specifies, or the federal government by law specifies what about voting?
Well, very little. As you know, the Constitution provides for an electoral college to choose the president and vice president, and the Constitution says each state can decide how to choose its members of the electoral college. They don't even require elections. The legislature could just name the members of the electoral college, which is how it was done in the early part of the 19th century. But then the Constitution does give Congress the right to regulate the time, date, place, and manner of elections for members of the House of Representatives and for the U.S. Senate. And that's the basis for enacting the Help America Vote Act, for example.
So that's the whole thing. That's the federal role.
That's it.
Then the states determine, who determines the system in which you have a primary, or whether you have a primary?
Well, the way we nominate our candidates for president and vice president is completely governed by the political parties.
Totally.
So the political parties set the rules within their own party. And then they have to sort of mesh those rules with what the state is willing to do if they're going to have a government-sponsored primary. So, for example, in Iowa, they select them by party caucuses. Well, the Iowa state government doesn't have anything to do with that selection process. That's just done by the political parties who set up their caucuses. But in most states...
That's why the Republicans have one date and the Democrats have another date in Iowa.
Because it's just set by their political parties. But if you're going to have a government-sponsored primary election that's going to be paid for by the state government, then the state gets to throw in their 2 cents on regulating how that primary works, how you get on the ballot for the primary, and what the effect of the primary is.
So who decides whether it's going to be a state thing? Because that's assuming then a cost, isn't it?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So that's up to each state legislature. So in New York, for example, if the New York State Democratic Committee decided that it did not want to participate in a primary, but wanted to hold caucuses instead, it could do that.
And it can decide whether it wants to have anything in a state, so that's why they can boycott a state.
Well, the national party sets the rules.
Yeah.
So if a state won't follow the national party rules, well, the national party says, well, then we're not going to recognize you as members of our party.
So isn't there a constitutional question around here? I mean, isn't it? I don't even know who's a member of the Democratic National Committee from New York anymore. I mean, I know 1 or 2 people, but that's it. But these are people who then go to Washington, make the decisions about the country's primaries, right? Boycott some states, and that means if my sister lived in Michigan and she's a Democrat, she's going to get a ballot on primary day with only Hillary Clinton's name on it for president. Isn't that denying her and me a certain role in a federal election?
Well, yes, it does, but the system is set up based on the political parties, and you can still run for a presidential election.
So it's by practice, it's not by any law.
It's not by any federal law, that's right. Yeah. It's by the political parties.
So if you ever want to change it, you most likely have to go to court and try?
I don't know that you'd win in court. Yeah. If you want to change it, you have to change the law. And so it may mean changing the Constitution.
Yeah, and no political party wants to do that because they lose control.
Well, the political parties don't want to do that, but if there were enough people who didn't agree with the process, they can always run independent candidates.
But there's some discussion, isn't there, about having some kind of a national system for nominating candidates?
There is. And there's a lot of argument over whether Congress has the authority to do that. But I think most people believe that Congress does have the authority.
So what are some of the thoughts about doing that?
Well, there are a lot of different ideas. One idea is simply to set the rules on the dates for primary elections. And of course, the one that's gaining the most circulation is to have 4 or 5 super primaries by region and rotate them each year. And
so you do north, east, or south, right, that kind of stuff.
That's right.
Right.
But that's the biggest problem now, is this race to the bottom where every state wants to be the first state in the presidential selection process, and you can't all be first. And so the political parties are trying to set rules, but if the states won't follow the rules, then their only remedy is to refuse to seat those delegates at the convention. So it's a tough choice for the parties. They don't want to do that either, but they also want to keep some order to the process.
So even then, not even being able to vote in a primary, you're not going to be able to be represented in the national convention. So then what happens to your electoral votes?
Well, your state party still has to make the decision whether or not they want to endorse the national candidates. So, for example, in New York, the procedure in New York is that after the national conventions, each state party actually has the process under New York state law to nominate its candidates for presidential elector.
I see. So they take the results of that convention and then officially put it on the ballot.
That's right. And if they didn't like the convention results, they could endorse a different candidate for president.
They have to go out with petitions after the convention.
No, the law allows the state party to just name the candidates for presidential
So there are
elector.
no petitions after the primary.
That's right.
That's interesting, right. So, but conceivably then, well, what does happen to an electoral? If the state, will the law allow Florida to support Florida will be able to support the winner of the primary.
Right, that'll be a choice up to the state committee of the party.
Well, aren't they forced to do that?
No.
Suppose if they decide not to do that.
Well, first of all, it's happened frequently. Well, for example, when George Wallace was running for president in 1964, a number of southern states endorsed George Wallace and not Lyndon Johnson. And the result is that in 1968, the National Party retaliated by refusing to seat delegates from those states, or seating delegates from alternative organizations from the local state committee. So, for example, Mississippi, in 1968, the State Democratic Committee refused to seat the delegates selected by the Mississippi Democratic Party, who had endorsed George Wallace, and instead recognized the delegates from the Mississippi Freedom
Party. I remember that, yes.
And of course that was very controversial and split the 1968 convention terribly.
Yeah. So this is the most complicated system, so it's better if you don't really know it and you just follow and you decide to go. Now what happens in California with the suggestion that they break up the electoral vote according to the congressional district vote?
Well, how disingenuous that process is. It's just a blatant grab from the Republicans to try to divide the California electoral vote. And, you know, if we did that nationwide, that would be one thing. And of course, there's a movement now to have states agree that their electors will vote for the winner of the popular vote nationwide. And the way they've worked it is very clever. They've said it will go into effect when a majority of when states representing a majority of the members of the Electoral College agree to be bound that way. So if the states were to adopt, and several states have already adopted this, but nowhere near a majority yet, but if a majority were to adopt it, then without amending the Constitution, we could have a national popular vote for president.
So right now, is every state winner take all?
Not every state. There are 3 or 4 states, small states. I think Maine and Nebraska are 2 that I recall that award 2 votes statewide and then 1 elector to each congressional district.
And the number of electors is dependent on the census population? Is that what it is?
Well, you get one for every member of Congress. So the Senate, so each state has two, because each state has 2 senators, and then you get one for each of your representatives in the House of Representatives.
So California has the most. It has what, 51 elected? I think it's 51. I think then it's New York is third.
That's correct.
Right.
And Texas is
31, and Texas has 35. I think
Right.
is what, about like that. Did we? There was a time when we had the most. Right?
That's correct.
It's a sad
Until 20
state
years
of
ago.
affairs. So now, what's happening in the state as far as elections? I mean, what are you doing for election reform?
Well, the major issue that the governor is pushing and is supported by most Democrats in the state is campaign finance reform, which is very important. New York has a very transparent system. In fact, we were rated as the best transparency of the system in the country because of our computer filing systems and the ease of being able to discover campaign contributions. But on the other hand, the disclosure laws are riddled with loopholes. And so what the governor is trying to do is close those loopholes. And so far, the Republicans in the state Senate have been vigorously resisting that.
So the Democrats have to win a majority in the state Senate for us to get that reform. Is that
like
right?
so many other changes in the state. That's right.
Anybody can go onto your website and actually find the contributors to a specific candidate?
That's right, and it's very easy. You can look it up by contributor. So if you have an individual in mind, you can look up to see how much and to whom that person has contributed. You can look it up by campaign or candidate, or you can look it up by office. And I urge people to go. It's very user-friendly. It's elections.state.ny.us.
Or if you just Google New York State elections or Board of Elections,
that's right.
You get it up. There's no limitation on what candidates can spend. When you talk about campaign finance, are you also talking about a system similar to the one we have in the city, maybe with some changes, but where public funds are used and then there's a limitation on how much you can spend?
Well, certainly that's a reform that a lot of people are talking about, especially for judicial elections, I think is the next place where it could happen on a statewide basis.
Have there been changes in the judicial elections?
No, and there is a case pending before the U.S. Supreme Court that was argued on October 4th, challenging the system for nominating candidates for Supreme Court judge in New York State. So everyone is eagerly awaiting the decision of the U.S. Supreme Court.
Who brought the case?
It was brought by Judge Lopez Torres in Brooklyn, who was claiming that she was denied the ability to be a meaningful candidate by the way the convention system works.
It's an interesting case, right?
It's a very interesting case, and I think it's surprised a lot of people when Judge Gleason in the U.S. District Court originally ruled that the system was unconstitutional, and then he was affirmed by the Second Circuit Court of Appeals.
So are you guys the ones that are appealing it?
The State Board of Elections is a party to that case, and even before I was commissioner of the State Board of Elections, it turns out that I was the expert witness for the political parties. I happen to think the convention system is a good way to choose our Supreme Court candidates.
That's an interesting thing. There is something on the ballot this year. We are going to have an election this November.
Yes, but in New York City, certainly in Manhattan, it's a small race. The only offices that are on the ballot are judge elections, and both the Democrats and Republicans have nominated the same candidates. So people who go to vote in Manhattan this year are going to find that it's really a pro forma exercise of their citizenship. But somebody does have to choose these judges, and they need to.
So they need
win
some
an
votes
election.
cast. Is there not an amendment on the ballot? Is there?
I think there are two amendments to the state constitution. One is to our Adirondack Preserve requires that whenever any of the Adirondack lands are used, it has to be an amendment to the Constitution, and there's a land swap deal.
I read about that. I think it wasn't long, like it was, I've forgotten. It's an acre from one place to another, and in return they're giving more land or something.
That's correct.
To a township. Yeah.
Right.
So that'll be for the state to vote on.
That's correct.
So how much does an election cost, and who pays for that?
Well,
counties?
The taxpayers pay for the elections, and almost all of the costs are borne by the counties.
Counties. So there's no equalization. I mean, New York City pays a lot of money then, compared to other counties in the state.
Well, everybody pays their own cost of running their elections locally.
So do you think that with HAVA, do we have to have identification when you go, and is that connected to the driver license question and the whole thing? Well,
yes, but New York has a fairly liberal identification rules. New York really has the minimal requirements that meet the federal Help America Vote Act. And it only applies for newly registered voters. So when you register to vote, you put your driver's license or non-driver's ID number or the last 4 digits of your Social Security number on your voter registration form, and that's checked, and if it checks, then you're no longer required to give any further identification. If it doesn't check, then you have to give identification at the polls, and there's a whole wide variety of things that you can use for identification at the polls.
How did you get interested in all of this? How did you become this expert?
I was always interested in politics, and when I came to law school in New York, I immediately joined my local Democratic club. And I found that the process of getting involved, to know your elected officials and be involved in the process of choosing your elected officials, is something that I find very interesting and stimulating.
Did you go into the voting booth with your parents when they voted? When you were young?
I did.
I did too. I always remember that. That was a very important thing, wasn't it?
I urge people to do that.
Yeah. As New York, a member of as the co-chair of the New York Board of Elections and a former member of the New York City Board of Elections, who else do you talk to around the country? Is there a formal network, or is there an informal network? How do we communicate? Well,
there are lots of different policy advocates on national election issues. And I got very involved beginning in 1993 when New York City was going to buy direct recording electronic machines. And I was very concerned that those machines had no security function in them, that you could not tell that the vote you were casting, or that you thought you were casting on the machine, was actually going to be counted for the candidate that you were pushing the button for. And so I became a big advocate for having proper security on those machines, and so I've joined a number of national boards of organizations that have been working on voting and voting machine issues.
Who is some of them?
Well, verifiedvoting.org is really the first nationwide organization to pick up on this. And now there's a group called the Accurate Voting Foundation, which has a contract with the National Institute of Standards and Technology to help develop national standards for voting systems, and I'm very active in that. And just this week I'm going to a summit conference in Minneapolis for an organization that's promoting effective auditing of election operations. That, we run elections, and the election may be over, the recount may be over, but nobody actually goes back and says, well, did everything work the way it was supposed to work? And is there any way that we can do this better? And the idea of having routine audits of the election machinery, I think, is a very important way to make sure that our elections are running the best way we can run them.
One of the things that people always complain about when they go to the poll to vote is the local group that is manning the machine or the books. And that used to be a very informal system where people were assigned to it by the local political clubs, right?
And they still are.
They still are. Are they mandated to take any courses or training?
They are. And it's become an increasingly complicated job. And it's a very difficult job to to do just 2 days a year on primary day and election day. And we ask more and more of, we call them inspectors in New York, the people who perform that job. In New York City, they get paid $200 for a 16-hour day, so it's a long day. Starts at 5:30 in the morning because the polls open at 6, and it goes until
9:30.
well, the polls close at 9, and it takes a
Yeah.
little while to count the votes and do that work. So it's a 16-hour day, and in New York City, it's 30,000 people we need to do that job, and recruiting and training those people is the single biggest.
Should we do it the same way we select juries? And send out notices and do a voir dire and then pick people and they have to be assigned to polls?
Well, I don't know that will that will get the most effective service. But one of the things that people talk about is giving them credit for jury duty if they're willing to serve as an inspector. And in some states, they're actually called election jurors. And I've suggested that one of the things we could do is change the name from election inspector to election jurors. And if you're serving on the election jury, that should count as jury duty because you're doing your civic duty. And as I say,
you're getting paid more money.
Well, you get paid more than you get for jury
right.
duty, but it's still, to take the training and to do the job well is an important thing. And I certainly would urge all the viewers to certainly sign up if you have an interest. Notwithstanding the fact that they're officially appointed by the political parties, there are vacancies throughout New York City, and if they go on the New York City Board website, for example, they can download the application to be named as an election inspector, and it's a great civic function to do that.
Thank you very much. We're finished. But I hope we'll come back before we vote next year in the presidential election. The primary, we didn't even talk about that. The primary is almost on top of us.
That's
isn't
right,
it?
February 5th.
February 5th. So thank you, Doug Kellner, and lots of good luck. And we look to you for our voting methods that will enable us to really do it well.
Thanks, Ronnie. It's a pleasure.
If there are any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore, please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.